Let's look at the relationships. Relationships can also have attributes. And also, sometimes two entities can have more than one type of relationship between them. You may have multiple relationships between two entities. For example, one entity is employee and the other entity is department. One relationship between the employee and department is that the employee works at the department. And then the other relationship is the employee manages the department, if the employee is the manager of the department. So as you can see, sometimes between two entity types, you can have multiple relationships. We also have something called the associative entity, which is a combination of relationship and entity. And we will talk about associative entity in a later slide. Degree of relationships is the number of entity types that participate in the relationship. Here we are going to look at three different types of relationships. One is the unary relationship, which means only one entity type participates in it. Binary relationship, two entity types participate in the relationship. And the ternary relationship, three entity types participate in the relationship. These are the notations for unary, binary, and the ternary relationships. One thing you want to remember is that a ternary relationship is different from three binary relationships. It's three entity types having relationship simultaneously. This is an example of the ternary relationship. Vendor, warehouse, and the parts. The vendor will ship to a number of warehouses. The warehouse may get shipment from multiple vendors, and the vendor may supply multiple parts. The warehouse may store multiple parts. So as you can see, this is a many-to-many ternary relationship. A ternary relationship is different from three binary relationships because these three entity types, they have a relationship simultaneously. We have three different types of cardinalities, one-to-one, one-to-many, and the many-to-many. So let's look at some examples of the unary, binary, and the ternary relationships here. There can be three different types of unary relationships and three different types of binary relationships. Let's look at this first, the unary relationship, person. A person is married to person. For this particular unary relationship, you have a one-to-one unary relationship because one person can be only married to one person. Let's draw the minimum cardinality and the maximum cardinality for this relationship. What if we want to draw both the minimum cardinality and the maximum cardinality? Well, what you do is you say for one person, what's the minimum number of person that person can be married? 0, right? So the minimum cardinality will be 0. For one person, what's the maximum number of person the person can be married to concurrently? And the maximum is 1. And for employee, it's a one-to-many relationship because one employee can manage many other employees. So if we want to draw both the minimum and the maximum, for one employee, what's the minimum number of employee that employee will be managing? 1. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a manager. And what's the maximum number of employee you will be managing? Which is many. For one employee, what's the minimum number of supervisors the employee can have? Which is 1. And what's the maximum number of supervisors the employee can have? Here it's referring to the immediate supervisor. And in most cases, it's also 1. 1 and only 1 here. This example referring to sports team ranking. It's a one-to-one situation because you only have one team in front of you and one team after you. Binary relationships, again, we have one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many binary relationships. Employee is assigned a parking space. One employee has only one parking space. Between these two, what's the minimum cardinality? For one employee, what's the minimum number of parking space the employee can have? The employee may not have a parking space. What's the maximum number? It's 1. And for one parking space, what's the minimum number of employee that can occupy it? Well, maybe the parking space is not assigned to anybody, so it can be 0. And then what's the maximum number of employee can be assigned to it? Then it will be 1. If multiple employees can share the same parking space, then it will be many. Product line and the product, it's a one-to-many situation, pretty common one. Many-to-many situation here, student and the course. We know it's a many-to-many relationship. So what's the minimum cardinality here? Let's say for one student, what's the minimum number of courses the student can take? 0. The student doesn't have to be registered for any course. The maximum would be many. For one course, what's the minimum number of students can be registered for it? Can be 0. No student is in that course. You have optional many for both sides. For the ternary relationship, in most cases, it's usually many-to-many. In this case, the relationship has an attribute associated with it. The shipping mode, whether it's overnight shipping or it's 2-day shipping or ground shipping, and the unit cost for the part may be different, depends on who the vendor is and which warehouse it's shipping to. That's why these two attributes are associated with the relationship rather than with any of these entity types. The strong and the weak entity. Strong entities are the ones that can exist independently of other types of entities, has its own unique identifier, its own primary key. The weak entity depends on a strong entity, does not have a unique identifier. They only have a partial identifier. And the relationship between a strong entity and a weak entity is called an identifying relationship. Here is an example of the strong entity, employee, and the weak entity, dependent. And for the weak entity dependent here, it doesn't have a unique identifier. It only has a partial identifier, dependent name. Okay, and you use double lines for this partial identifier. Let's talk about associative entities. Now, we actually have seen a number of examples of associative entities in previous slides. Well, associative entity is both an entity and a relationship. When would you create an associative entity? First of all, you need to make sure that all the relationships involved here are many-to-many relationships. The other criteria for associative entity is that the associative entity should have a meaning independent of other entities. So when you create this new entity called associative entity, it needs to have its own meaning. The third criteria is that the associative entity preferably has a unique identifier and should also have other attributes. It cannot be an empty entity. It needs to have other attributes. The associative entity may participate in other relationships other than the entities of the associated relationships. Ternary relationships should be converted to associative entity. So when you see a ternary relationship, usually you will create an associative entity. So those are some of the criteria for creating associative entity. Let's take a look at an example here. In this case, we have employee and course. These two have a many-to-many relationship. So that meets the first criteria. There is an attribute associated with the relationship, which is the date completed. Because the date on which the course is completed is not associated with the employee or the course. It's associated with the relationship that the employee completes a course. So that meets another criteria of the associative entity. You may be able to convert this into an associative entity that looks like this. You can call the associative entity certificate because it's got a separate meaning. It's a certificate that you get when you complete a course. So that meets another criteria of the associative entity. For the certificate associative entity, you also have an identifier or a primary key. Here is called a certificate number. That's a natural identifier for the certificate entity. And also it has other attribute, which is date completed. As you can see, it again meets another criteria of the associative entity. And the certificate itself can also have relationships with other entities. For example, it can have a relationship with the certificate granting institute. Eventually what you will have is 3 tables. The certificate will become a table by itself. So these are the things that you need to do when you create an associative entity. When you see that 2 entities here having a many-to-many relationship and also their attributes associated with this relationship, so what you do is, first, you create an associative entity in the middle with rounded corners. Okay, let's call it certificate. Then the next thing you do is you need to switch these many-to-many signs to the certificate. entity. And you will put the 1 on the employee and the cost table. So why is that? Well, the reason is because for one employee, the employee can have multiple certificates. But for one certificate, it can only belong to one employee. And same thing for the course. For one course, it can issue multiple certificates, but for one certificate, it can be only referring to one course. A unary relationship and a many-to-many situation. An item contains other items. This is really a many-to-many relationship. It's a special situation called a bill of materials structure. You often see this in the manufacturing company. When you make one item, you probably need a number of components. So for one item, it probably will include many different other items. And the item may be a component of many other products. So that's why it's a many-to-many unary relationship. In this case, the relationship, the item contains other items. There is an attribute associated with it, which is quantity. For example, in this computer, you have 2 microprocessors. So the quantity is really associated with the relationship. What you do is you convert this into an associative entity. You change the many sign to this side, and you put 1 on this side. And you put the quantity as an attribute for this associative entity. You also have effective date as part of entity here. For ternary relationships, you always make an associative entity. You create an associative entity in the middle, apply schedule.